This week, we continue our conversation with Lex and Max Brook, moving on to some more general L5R questions and questions about game design.
If you had to sum up your philosophy or approach to Legend of the Five Rings, particularly in terms of game design, what would you say?
I try to create fun, inclusive, and quality content. The game line is super awesome, but it's also sensitive. I want to make sure everything that I touch ends up being as best as it can be with the time and resources we have available.
Mm-hmm.
So what new do you want to bring to Legend of the Five Rings that is different than has gone before?
I think the thrust that particularly Max and I are trying to do is to include more perspectives, particularly with the writers that we pull on to do sections in the books, create more varied stories, even within Rokugan, because I think sometimes people think Rokugan is, it's just Rokugan. Like, all the people are the same. Definitely they're not, obviously, because we have all the different clans. But even within the clans, there's so much variation. And bringing that out and showing that, I think, is really important. Yeah, let's just say Rokugan and the world is a really big place.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And no one adheres to the various stereotypes. Exactly. Everyone's different in their own way. Do you play much yourself, the role-playing game, and do you have a particular type of campaign you like most?
Unfortunately, I am not usually able to get groups together that want to play it, which makes me very sad. So I haven't actually gotten to play in a while. I think the last game I played was maybe January, which is really sad to think about. Okay, so I'm called out here. If you look at Path of Ways and Celestial Realms, which I did like the majority of the development work on, I totally love the supernatural and spiritual aspects of Rokugan, so games that I play usually have a lot of that in them.
A lot of yokai.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I love them. And then after that, I lean towards intrigue and court stuff, because the politics in Rokugan are just so fascinating.
What does game balance really mean to you?
When I'm thinking about game balance in RPGs, I ask myself a bunch of different questions. Is it fun? Does it work well with the other aspects of the game? Will other players feel underpowered or overpowered by comparison? Because there's different types of success, like even just talking about Shugenja and Bushi, right? Like, you can have really awesome moments as a Shugenja and really awesome moments as a Bushi, and those moments don't have to be the same moments to still feel like you're both doing something. And the other question I ask is, does it give the GM a regular headache or an exceptional headache? That's pretty important.
Okay.
I take it the assumption is regular headache is just expected. It's
oh, yes.
Is it going to give them exceptional headache? My problem, I think, when it comes to game balancing quotes, is what do you throw at the players? So it feels like it was a challenge, but it doesn't actually murder them all.
And that's a difficulty you see with a lot of different RPGs in terms of their like combat rating system and just making it feel right, because the power levels in terms of like when are your shining moments, and if you have a character that their shining moment isn't necessarily combat, then the game balance can feel a little wonky, even though they still do have shining moments. So it's an unending battle, honestly, and it requires the game master to be really flexible and to think on their feet. That's something that I just take as part of being a game master.
I think what is very clear is that it can't be geared to the sort of antagonistic or even the OSR type, neutral arbiter type GM relationship with the players. You have to be a bit more trusting, because you're explicitly required to give the players the target numbers for everything, which I think is a very interesting relationship between the GM and the players, which not all games go for.
A lot of the system seems to me to be reliant on GM interpretation of when this advantage would apply or this ability would apply because of the narrative aspect. So that needs an extremely trusting player to GM relationship.
I think in some ways L5R doesn't actually require more GM player trust than any other system. It just is more honest about the need for GM player trust. Because at the end of the day, it's not like GM player trust breakdowns don't cause problems in D&D or Pathfinder. Because L5R is more honest about the need for that trust in some ways in its mechanics, I think both D&D and Pathfinder do say you're not trying to beat your players, you're trying to have fun together. Because the mechanics are very much built around that philosophy that we're telling a story together, this is a collaborative narrative game, there are definitely less opportunities to just sort of blame the game system. And I think that is something that people definitely hit on, and I think is one of those trade-off choices, right? Like, the more cast in stone the game system is, the less options it gives the GM, the more the GM can just say, hey, I'm sorry, your character died, that's just how massive damage works. But on the other hand, that means that as a GM, you have to understand how massive damage works really well, not to accidentally blow up your players. And so it just shifts where the burden is and where the discussion falls. And I don't think that's intrinsically good or bad, though it does facilitate some play styles. I think given L5R's focus on intrigue, on nonviolent conflict resolution in a lot of cases, or on considering nonviolent conflict resolution as an option where other games often don't have it, or only have it in the sense that they say you can do it but don't really have mechanics to support it, I think there's a lot of reason to be open about the fact that this is an exercise where we need to trust each other. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lex?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with it, honestly, especially with the sentiment that it just shifts burden. It's not that it's more or less than another system. It's just where is it?
And I do think for some story and game styles, there's an advantage to having that burden on the system. If you want a procedural experience, maybe you want something that's closer to a tactical minis game, right? And you actually are learning that your character's story and the dice fall where they may, and your character dies undramatically to an arrow in the first act, and that's an interesting twist. If that's what you want, then that's the sort of system that you should go for.
I think there's another thing that if you're a new GM, having a game system that you can lean on and it will do a lot of the job for you, when you can just say, look, that's just what the rules say, because you haven't developed the muscles to improvise, to change things, because you don't know what things can be changed. So there's a lot to be said for that. GMing for L5R can be, I think, harder to do as a beginning GM.
I would agree with that.
And that's part of the reason we make the beginner game. I would say L5R is about comparable to Genesis in terms of GM difficulty. Genesis has more stuff to account for, but is slightly more traditional just because it was written earlier in its like player GM relationship, where Genesis is, other than story points, Genesis tends a little bit more towards the benevolent authoritarian GM model, and L5R is a little bit closer to, it's not like full on GM-less or anything, but I think it's a little further on the spectrum of GM player collaboration. But I would say they're pretty comparable, and that's part of the reason we do the beginner games, because the beginner games really are designed to walk you through everything and give you a model for how to play the game.